So James is always using imagery to tell us stories and to communicate God's truth in a way that we can see and touch and understand. It reminds me of another teacher who was also from the town of Nazareth, where James was from, and was also born to Mary. And I'm not talking about a Mary, I'm talking about the Mary. James is Jesus' younger brother, and it's almost like using imagery and stories as a family trait. Because we see Jesus all the time telling stories and using metaphors and examples so that we could understand God's kingdom and our place in it through things that we can see and touch and understand. And so here in James chapter 3, like we see all sorts of images. Like James uses boats and fire and horses and all kinds of animals and poison and trees and all these things to communicate to us. But I want to focus on two today. The first one comes from verse 5. It says, "How great a forest is set ablaze by such a small fire. And the tongue is a fire, a world of unrighteousness. The tongue is set among our members, staining the whole body, setting on fire the entire course of life, and set on fire by hell." And so James says our tongue is a fire, and we think, wow, that's really imaginative. But if you look back at his life, it's actually not imaginative at all. So James didn't believe that Jesus was God from early on. Like the Bible talks about how Jesus' family, but James specifically would openly mock Jesus to other people. But then James one day sees his brother resurrected, raised from the dead, and immediately says, oh my gosh, like he is God. So he turns from his ways and he joins the disciples. And that's why he was present on the day of Pentecost. If you read in Acts chapter 2, this is when the church really launched. And on that day, God sent fire. And it says that tongues of fire down on the disciples, and that God gave them the ability to teach in languages that they didn't know or understand. And he gave them wisdom to communicate. And so we see James saying like, man, I know what it's like to have a tongue set on fire from heaven because I taught about my brother's resurrection, but I also know what it's like to have a tongue set on fire by hell because I mocked and I rebuked him when he was here on earth. And he warns us that our natural lean is to that fire from hell because we're constantly cutting other people down and we're destroying others and we're biting at people. And so we need to control our tongues because of how much power they have. And that's going to lead us to the second image, which we find in verse 4. And it says, "Look at the ships also, though they are so large and are driven by strong winds, they are guided by a very small rudder wherever the will of the pilot directs. So also the tongue is a small member, yet it boasts of great things." So I was on a whitewater rafting trip one time in West Virginia with some buddies, and we had a guide on the back of the boat, and he used this oar like a rudder to kind of steer us around, and he would tell us like when to row ourselves and how to do it, but ultimately he steered where we went. And we were at one bit of rapids that were just a little bit bitey, and he's like back there just yelling and grunting with all the effort he's putting into steering us, and suddenly it goes quiet, because he fell out of the boat. And immediately like things just turned into chaos. We went sideways and hit a rock, and we're like spinning in these rapids, and people are falling off left and right. And I got one buddy hanging on for dear life, like another buddy just like floating and bobbing up and down in the rapids himself. And it was just nuts. And so we're finally about to tip over when we crashed into the opposite shore. And I mean, it was crazy because without a guide, we were at the mercy of all the currents that we're going through. And James says, so it is with our tongues. We are at the mercy of all the things that we are going through. We are at the mercy of the currents of bitterness and the currents of anger and the currents of frustration. But he tells us that we also can take control. And if we can control our tongues, we are like the people whose knowledge comes from above. And this is from verse 17. It says, "But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." So my question today is, what about you? Who's in control? Is it you or your tongue? Because James shows us so descriptively that everything depends on our answer to that question.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked it, smash that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more content. See you guys next week.